Before the scandal, before the apology, before the arrest turned her name from nostalgia into shock, Ryoko Hirosue was something Japan once seemed to protect with almost unreasonable tenderness. She was youth, made visible, not just famous, not just beautiful, but the kind of girl a whole country projects innocence onto before she is old enough to defend herself from it. That is where her story begins, not in chaos, in brightness. Ryoko Hirosue entered the entertainment world young, at the exact age when the camera can still mistake vulnerability for charm, and the public can mistake freshness for purity. She emerged in the mid-1990s and did not rise slowly. She arrived in the way only a few stars ever do, fast enough to feel fated, soft enough to feel harmless, and vivid enough that people began remembering her before they had fully learned who she was. That is a dangerous kind of fame. The audience does not just admire you, it begins writing a meaning onto your face. And Ryoko's face, in those years, became a national feeling. There was something almost too easy about the way she fit the mood of the era. Short hair, bright eyes, a smile that felt both open and slightly out of reach. She looked modern without losing softness, cute without seeming calculated, luminous without looking untouchable. That balance made her irresistible. She was not presented to the public as a difficult actress, not yet. She was something more powerful than that at first. A girl people wanted to keep looking at because she made youth itself seem fleeting and real at the same time. That was the beginning of the myth. Because the moment a country falls in love with a young actress like that, she stops belonging only to herself. She becomes a symbol of possibility, of memory, of whatever that generation is afraid of losing. And in Ryoko Hirosue's case, the symbol became huge very quickly. Television loved her. Advertising loved her. The public loved her in the way people love someone who feels like a reflection of a gentler version of themselves. Her popularity was not built only on talent, though the talent was there. It was built on atmosphere, on the feeling she created simply by appearing. And atmosphere can be more dangerous than scandal, because scandal arrives later. Atmosphere traps you first. As her career accelerated, Ryoko moved beyond the category of promising young face and into something much bigger: teen idol, actress, singer, national sweetheart. That kind of rise always looks glamorous from far away. Up close, it is a machine, a schedule, a constant performance of brightness. You smile, you appear. You sell the idea that youth is effortless. The public does not see the cost yet because the illusion is still working. It only sees a girl becoming iconic, and Ryoko became exactly that. By the late 1990s, she was no longer just part of the conversation. In many ways, she was the mood of it, a face that defined a period. A presence people associated with a kind of Japanese pop cultural innocence that now feels almost impossible to reproduce. That is what made her rise so powerful and later so fragile. The more completely a star becomes tied to innocence, the less room she has to become complicated without being punished for it. But none of that had exploded yet. In this first chapter, the world still wanted to believe in her without hesitation. She was young enough for the projection to feel natural, famous enough for the adoration to feel collective, and beautiful enough that people could mistake being beloved for being protected. That is the illusion at the center of so many female celebrity stories. The public thinks love is shelter. It is not. Sometimes it is the first cage, and Ryoko Hirosue was being placed inside one before anyone called it that. Because what the audience loved most was not only her talent or even her fame. It was the idea that she represented something unbroken, something sweet, something they could trust to remain emotionally untouched even as the world around her changed. She was not just watched. She was preserved in people's minds before she had even finished becoming herself. That is why her later story would hit so hard. Because when a woman is introduced to the world as a symbol of innocence, the public does not know how to react when life turns her into something messier, older, more wounded, more human. And Ryoko Hirosue was never going to stay suspended inside that first image forever. She only looked like she might. This part is grounded in Hirosue's 1990s debut and breakout as a teen idol actress, including her early modeling, TV start, and rapid rise across TV, film, and music. The first crack did not come from age. It came from desire. That is what made it feel so much harsher. For years, Ryoko Hirosue had been protected by an image so deeply tied to innocence that people almost forgot she was a woman with private impulses, private loneliness, private weakness. The country had loved her too long as a symbol to accept her easily as a person, and when that illusion finally broke, it did not break quietly. It broke through scandal. By the time the affair story surfaced, the shock was bigger than the event itself. Not because celebrity infidelity was new, not because the public had never seen a famous marriage collapse, but because Ryoko was not supposed to be this kind of woman in the public imagination. She was supposed to belong to an earlier, cleaner version of fame, the kind built on softness, nostalgia, and emotional trust. So when her name became attached to betrayal, apology, and public humiliation, the reaction was immediate. The scandal did not simply expose a private mistake, it rewrote the emotional contract people thought they had with her. That is always the cruelest part. The public never punishes a scandal evenly. It punishes according to the image it had already built. And Ryoko's image had been too pure for something like this to feel ordinary. What might have been treated as messy adult failure in another celebrity became, in her case, something closer to disillusionment. The woman once seen as a national sweetheart was suddenly being discussed in the language of shame. Not just disappointment, but collapse. Not just gossip, but moral failure. And once that tone enters the story, it changes everything. She apologized, her career was halted, her marriage ended. But even those facts only explain part of what happened. The deeper damage was symbolic. It was the destruction of a version of Ryoko Hirosue that had lived in the public mind for decades. The bright girl, the untouched memory, the woman people wanted to believe had remained somehow separate from the uglier instincts of ordinary adult life. That version could not survive the affair. It did not matter whether people understood her, sympathized with her, or eventually softened. The old image had already taken a hit it could never fully recover from. That is what makes this chapter more tragic than scandalous. Because the affair did not transform Ryoko into someone dark. It simply forced the public to admit that the innocence it loved had always been, at least partly, projection, and audiences hate admitting they were the ones who invented the fantasy in the first place. It is easier to blame the woman for falling than to admit she was never meant to stay suspended in purity forever. So this was not just the beginning of backlash, it was the end of protection. From that point on, Ryoko Hirosue was no longer being watched as a preserved symbol from another era. She was being watched as a woman who had disappointed the story people wanted her to keep telling. And once a star loses that kind of innocence, every future mistake looks louder, darker, and more final than it really is. That was the first real fall, and it would not be the last. This section follows the 2023 affair admission, the work suspension that followed, and the divorce announced a month later. Then the story turned from scandal to chaos, because an affair can still be explained as weakness, a mistake, a private collapse that spilled into public view. But what happened next around Ryoko Hirosue felt far more unsettling than that. It did not look like controlled damage anymore. It looked like disorientation, like a life that had stopped moving in a straight line. That is why this chapter hits harder. By the time her name returned to the headlines again, the public was no longer seeing her as the woman who had betrayed an image of innocence. Now it was seeing something more alarming. A former icon moving through a moment that felt unstable, unpredictable, and impossible to package into a clean narrative. After the 2023 scandal, people had already rewritten her story once. They had already shifted her from national sweetheart to fallen figure. But in 2025, the tone darkened again. This time, it was not about romance, it was about control. After a traffic accident in Shizuoka, Ryoko Hirosue was arrested on suspicion of injuring a nurse at a hospital. Even stripped down to the bare facts, the story sounded shocking. A car crash, a hospital, an arrest. An actress once associated with innocence now appearing in headlines that felt jagged, chaotic, almost surreal. It was the kind of event that makes people stop reading like fans and start reading like witnesses. And that shift matters. Because once a celebrity stops looking scandalous and starts looking unstable, the public gaze changes completely. It becomes colder, less curious, more severe. People no longer ask whether the image is broken, they assume it is. What they want to know now is how bad the damage really is. And with Ryoko, that question carried a particularly sharp edge because her old image had been built on emotional trust for so long. She was not supposed to end up in this kind of story. Not this late, not like this. That is what made it feel so tragic. Not just the incident itself, but the contrast. The violent distance between the Ryoko people remembered and the Ryoko now appearing in the news. One version belonged to nostalgia, youth and softness. The other belonged to disorder, public concern, and the unnerving suggestion that something had gone seriously wrong beneath the surface. The public did not just see a fallen star. It saw a woman who no longer fit inside the emotional frame it had spent decades protecting. And once that happens, sympathy becomes complicated. Because people do not know whether to judge, pity, or step back in silence. They do not know whether they are looking at recklessness, pain, exhaustion, or the aftermath of too many cracks left untreated for too long. The details become secondary. What remains is the atmosphere, the sense that Ryoko Hirosue's story had moved beyond scandal and into something sadder, something that could no longer be consumed as simple gossip. This was not the glamorous destruction the tabloids know how to sell. It was messier than that, harder to romanticize, harder to turn into entertainment without feeling cruel. And maybe that is why it lingered so heavily. Because by then, Ryoko was no longer just a symbol that had fallen. She was a woman the public could no longer explain away. And that may have been the darkest turn of all. This section draws on the 2025 crash and arrest episode, where she was arrested on suspicion of injuring a nurse after a traffic accident. What makes Ryoko Hirosue's story so haunting is not that she fell, it is the way she kept changing shape in public. First she was innocence, then she became disappointment, then chaos. And now, after everything, she stands in a place that may be even harder to survive than scandal itself, the place where the public no longer knows what to call her. That is the real ending to stories like this. Not a clean comeback, not a total ruin. Just a woman returning to a world that remembers too many versions of her at once. Because when Ryoko Hirosue announced that she would resume activities, the moment did not feel triumphant. It felt fragile, careful, almost uneasy. There was no way for it to be anything else. Too much had happened. The affair had already shattered one version of her. The crash, the arrest, and the disturbing headlines that followed had shattered another. By the time she stepped back toward public life, she was no longer returning as the girl people once adored. She was returning as someone marked by everything the public had already seen, and everything it still could not fully understand. That is why this ending feels sadder than dramatic. Because the real question is no longer whether Ryoko can work again. She can. The real question is whether the world will ever let her exist outside the shadow of what has already happened. Whether a woman once preserved as a national memory can still be seen as human after disappointing that memory so completely. Whether audiences truly forgive or simply grow quiet and wait to see what breaks next. And maybe that is the cruelest part of fame. Not the scandal, not the apology, not even the punishment, but the fact that once the public has watched you crack, it never looks at your return with innocence again. So Ryoko Hirosue's story does not end with the old image restored. It ends with something much less comforting and much more real. A woman walking back into the light without the protection of myth. No longer the untouched symbol of youth. No longer just the fallen sweetheart from a tabloid disaster, but someone more exposed than either version ever was. And perhaps that is the final truth of her story. She was never destroyed in one moment. She was slowly stripped of the fantasy that once made people love her so easily. What remains now is not the legend Japan first embraced. It is the woman who survived after the legend was gone. Background facts for this ending include Hirosue's suspension after the 2025 incident, the January 2026 fine over negligent driving, and her April 2026 return announcement.